now.
Okay.
I just posted to Facebook. Oh, my little YouTube reminder just came up on my phone.
Very good.
Now I have the custom live streaming, and I also have live on YouTube as options. No, not anymore. So that was that. So the custom live was the right one. Let me just go back into it and see if we're okay. There we go.
Okay, I see us live on YouTube.
Ron's.
Cool. All right, so I'm gonna make this official and start us off. All right, where are we? Okay.
Okay, let's give it a couple minutes for people to join.
Yeah.
And I'll give you a heads up when I've got exactly 7 o'clock. We can get started.
Also, while we're waiting, how can I share it on my Facebook? Sorry.
Take the YouTube link, and you can actually just take the YouTube link. Actually, let me open up a chat.
I went to Ash's Facebook page, and her last post was posting out the links and information. So I just shared it to my page and just said, hey, this is starting now live on YouTube. Click the link below.
Yeah, so if you want to do that as well, Alon, that'll be great.
Okay. I'm just opening it up for myself to make sure that I have it here. There we go.
Okay. I've got 7 o'clock. Ash, take it away.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this live event for Reckoning in the Rubble, my memoir. And I want to thank you guys for coming today. I want to thank you guys for joining us. I have some incredible friends and guests with me that are going to be guiding us through the evening. I have Eli and Victoria, who are helping me produce this. And I'm very grateful. I've known both of them for a very long time and worked with them and for them at CNN. And they've been incredibly kind and supportive. And you guys also see on the screen, we see Halan and Matt, who are two amazing people who I was in Mosul with, who I was in Iraq with, who I worked alongside. At the time, Matt was working for an NGO in Iraq, and he's now in San Diego, but he has done a lot of NGO work and a lot of communications work and was on the front line. And we just really connected while I was there. And Halan worked as one of our fixers. For those of you who don't know what a fixer is somebody who fixes you up with a story. They're almost like your sort of mini producer in the field, and often will drive and translate, and they know people and know how to get places and know how to help you sort of support your story. So Halan was one of many that a lot of the correspondents used throughout that time and space. And he's in Erbil now. Are you in Erbil, Halan? So I'm really grateful. It's very late night there, so I'm very grateful for him joining us. So tonight, I'm going to jump into a reading here shortly. I'm going to show you guys a little bit of my reel and experience. I'm going to jump into a reading. Then afterwards, we're going to have some conversation. And we have another panelist who's going to be coming on in a little while as well. There is a Zoom link if you guys are interested in asking questions or commentating in the space. Or you can also jump into the YouTube box and let us know you're there. And you can also put questions in the YouTube box as well. And we'll do our best to take a look at some of those. So I am so thankful for your presence and your energy tonight, and I'm glad that you guys are here, so welcome. Okay, so I'm going to run this before I do a share here, I'm going to get this set up. And forgive me, this is all a little bit raw. So
in about 250 meters from where the mosque blew up, we spoke to the Iraqi Federal Police a little bit ago, Sergeant Hussein. He actually told us that they heard a loud boom, and then when he turned around, he noticed that there were plumes of white smoke coming off of where the mosque should be.
They said that the humanitarian crisis is not over. Artillery fire, snipers, and mortars are volleyed back and forth.
Both actually had bombs strapped around their bodies, and they were surrounded by IEDs.
They're trying to close in. They're certainly using everything that they have.
That ancient light on your shoulder, the river of time, love is all that's left to me. Love is all that's left to me.
People had enough of Daesh.
All my girls with me and they were getting harassed. We took the highway road and were hit by mortars.
We're displaced. We're not safe.
Now ISIS just using the AK, sniper, and handgun.
Not alone anymore. Not alone anymore.
People may also be stuck under the rubble. Much of West Mosul is actually destroyed.
The voices are resting in your bones.
Daesh is over in the country.
The river of time. Love is all that's left.
Despite the fact that this place was severely broken, it was still standing.
Love is all that's left.
The COVID-19 pandemic, the virus that's somehow been to more parts of America than Guy Fieri.
Hold on, sorry. I have no idea what's just happened.
Damn, this might not be over until like the summer.
Here, let me mute myself.
Yeah, it's just playing on your computer. It's okay. Stand by.
I thought maybe Trevor had invaded your place.
All right. Okay, you got to unmute yourself now again.
Okay, now,
Ash,
sorry, that took a
there we
minute.
go.
I had no idea. It went right to the next video and it was in full screen and disappeared, so I apologize.
No problem.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and read from chapter 3. This chapter is called The Tribes of Division. The individual who is not himself a combatant, and so is a cog of the gigantic machine of war, feels bewildered in his orientation and inhibited by his powers. By Sigmund Freud. The soldiers shot at him. His car broke down, Walid told us. He pressed the button and it didn't work. So the militant that was in the car called on the radio back to the others, telling them, the infidels broke down my car, but I can't make it explode. I cannot blow it up because the button does not work. If you have any other way, brothers, blow it up. I want to blow up the car up on the infidels. Walid laughed. Clearly his enemy was stupid, in his opinion. An airstrike would hit the car instead from the tribe that mattered, the one who was winning. Holed up in a house in Mosul, my colleague, translator, and I shared tea, cookies, and cigarettes with our host. Walid was part of the counterterrorism unit, a special forces unit trained by the US. His job that day was to listen to the radio in the room. They were picking up frequencies from Daesh fighters. He showed us weapons that they confiscated from the battlefield. And if they still worked, they recycled them and used them against the very enemy who made them. It's a funny thing being part of a tribe. Tribe is a word associated with the protective band of power, a word that reflects a state of self-protective groupthink. It comes from the Latin word referring to three states or groups, and ultimately refers to a clan held together by a common bond, like race, ethnic roots, political alliance, gender, religion, or creed. It's a word that binds people, and ironically, it is an involuntary initiation. You are born into tribes. They're the birthmark you know. And the tribes in Iraq truly seem to function within compatible chaos. Even so, like learning a language by immersion, I was a participant. But instead of learning the conjugation of words, I was submerged in a language of stories about people groups through the lens of war and survival. With their common enemy present, Daesh and the Iraqi tribes' distinguishing marks between each other mattered very little. That is, the differences between the Iraqi army, its special forces, and the Kurdish Peshmerga seemed to blur. The offshoot militias known as the Popular Mobilization Forces, or as they're known in Arabic, the Hashad al-Shabi, were comprised mostly of Shia Muslims and supported by Iran. But there were notably other groups of Sunni Muslims and ethnic Yazidi militias permitted to exist under Baghdad's authority. It was all in the name of defeating Daesh, the tribe believed to be far worse than its predecessor, Al-Qaeda. Nearly 21 other tribes, countries that is, joined them and banded together for one cause. They were and are led by the United States, one of, if not the most powerful forces in the world, an imperialistic tribe priding itself on promoting human rights. So this is rightfully disputed. And as long as the focus was on defeating Daesh, it didn't matter. Outside their common enemy, the tribes were each their own. For each soldier, commander, or supporting citizen, they felt they belonged, but their belonging was a process of fitting into the group's protective entity. Being included gives people a way of feeling accepted, and it does not matter if the tribe is not looking out for the person or the group's best interests. In fact, they may not be. They may be causing harm or stirring fear, but if a person feels acknowledged in that environment, in that fear, they will stay. They won't choose to be alone. Tribe is based on the idea of fitting in, being assimilated as part of the group, excluding others in the name of entitlement or divine rightness. Tribes claim us, and we're so attached to groupthink, we rarely defer from what they want, claiming it is our own, when in fact, it is not. And to be accepted, to be part of something bigger than ourselves, which we share with others, is a fulfilling space for the human experience. When everyone in the group shares traumatic experiences, the depth of soul is found at the heart of suffering, something together. And suffering always unites. It then gives us identity. Suffering shows the tenderness of our very real hearts because it creates a reaction and a wound. And it forms our very response to who we become. That loss, that betrayal, that shift in energy and circumstance molds our survival skills and establishes our sense of security. But it is also a motivator to shift in our way of existence. Author, speaker, and Pastor Rubble said in his series, Drops Like Stars, it's precisely because of pain, precisely because we want to overcome that pain, that we get a feeling through this process of really being alive. Therefore, it is a source of life. Pain and suffering become a precursor to a movement in one way of living into another way of living. But because our self-protective nature, that motivator can be used for the violence of our tribes or the betterment of our communities and selves. Indeed, the unifying factor among tribe is self-preservation. It's here the tribe forms a collective offensive to usurp authority to maintain control over the narrative. I remember riding through the streets of Ashura, just south of Mosul. Dead bodies everywhere, scattered carcasses strewn through the streets. They looked like demonstration dummies. I was in a 4x4 with friends from an NGO, Preemptive Love Coalition, and an Iraqi military commander. My friends, shaken by the sight, asked who would clean up the dead fighters? The commander replied, "That's what the dogs are for," with a smirk on his face. It was an unsettling response. The dead are only revered if they're on the winning side. And anyone who was deemed a dash fighter wasn't worthy of picking up off the floor. Then again, eventually families would come home and those bodies, they would end up in a mass grave or perhaps worse, dismembered by dogs. The stench itself left an energy in the air. And El Shoro wasn't necessarily cleared yet. There were shots fired and explosives detonated in the distance. We arrived at a house where federal police were meeting. I decided to put my vest on. It couldn't hurt to be a little safer in the haunting ghost town with fighters slinking through the urban streets. The commander made fun of me. He told me I should be a lioness and there was nothing to fear. He laughed as I put on my vest. I tried to ignore him and told him I'd rather be safe than sorry. He persisted. Jeremy Courtney stepped in and told him she's an international journalist and explained my job required it of me. The commander stopped. He then led us into the room where a number of officers were drinking tea and talking. They disturbingly theorized that the civilians who fled were actually sympathizers of Daesh. Courtney would later retort, it's those assumptions making it harder for people to get aid who need it most, but for the Iraqi army, such a belief was rooted deep in their mistrust of Mosul's population. Mosul had been largely Sunni Muslim, and while it's true many sympathized with Daesh, it was often because the majority Shia Muslim security forces had targeted them. I spoke to one woman later who admitted her husband joined the Daesh fighters because their daughters were getting harassed by Iraqi security forces. And even General Najim Jabori, head of Nineveh's operations against Daesh, admitted there had been problems with security forces. They had not given people a reason to trust them. General Jabori had seen the unraveling of Iraq. He had been mayor of Tel Afar in 2005, a city northeast of Mosul, and he himself was from southern Mosul. He worked with the US retired General H.R. McMaster. Together, they hoped to unify the city between the Sunni and the Shia groups. Jabori had hope, and for him, it's what he held on to build a future Iraq. Jabori understood there were problems, and the commanders of the security forces made mistakes. Police, he said, from the Shia side attacked the Sunni. They didn't consider the people's needs. There was no trust. So it created dissent between the people, and the very forces entrusted to protect them, he believed they needed to establish an Iraqi identity rather than one of the tribes, Shia or Sunni. Such division is a powerful weapon. It establishes a need for rightness and wrongness. In some sense, it can create order, but it can also create chaos. It's a jarring thing to listen to one tribe discard another, devalue the blood and flesh of one man in favor of another, though we all do it. We've all been subjected to it even. There is a violence in all of us. There is a violence in me. There is a fight in all of us when we feel we are all on the better end of humanity. There is a sense of defending what we feel is right. To be right is to be powerful. And I was groomed in division. At 8 years old, I was given a role, but in name only. My sibling was born then. She was given the same type of role. Each parent picked their ally. We understood tribalism before we knew what the word itself meant. We understood the grounds for solving tension would be war and someone winning. Oh, we were chastised for trying to win, but our examples only expressed the importance of rightness in conjunction with winning. They fiercely believed they had the right words, but their actions did not follow. They demanded of us as children, do as we say, not as we do, but it didn't work. Their division created our competition for rightness in our small world. The division was our security because it gave us places to fit in, a miniature tribe, one against the other. We weren't taught to be sisters. We were kept from each other most of the time, and fighting between us was a game. Who could get both of them to side with only one of us? It's disastrous. And most of the time, she, the younger, gained their empathies. That's not to say they cared or had her best interest in mind, but I was growing into a teenager with a mind of my own. That was seen as a threat. She was much younger, more pleasing, easier to mold. Stepping out of their dominance and narrative was not acceptable. I was getting harder to control, but the truth was, when she became a teenager, she too would experience the same damning abuses. By then, it had grown worse between our parental figures, and I was no longer there. She was caught between them alone. Because I had no sense of how to be a sister, I had no idea how to help her, and I didn't. It wouldn't be until we were much older. We saw the stain in this energy. We rejected and changed it. Now, yes, we're on the same side with love and dignity and grace. We are a miniature community. And from a vulnerable space, given the chance to know each other for the very first time, out of the common suffering, we came together this time to establish understanding. My dear sister, well, she made the first move too. After years of not communicating, I got a text saying, think of you sometimes, and you're right to stay away from our parents. It took me longer to find out. It took me a few days to respond. I saw your IG message. Honestly, I think I've been mulling over what to say. I think about you too sometimes. My lack of contact was never about you. You should know that. I'm not mad at you. I never was. It was always about me. It opened us up to remorse, apology, healing, the truth, and love. We had a lot to cover. We emailed for a while, asking each other trivia questions, filling in gaps we missed for so many years. Then we moved to phone calls and FaceTime. Discovering my sister for the first time was remarkable. She was this person who sort of looked like me, who was funny and cool and interesting. She was a person rather than a distant memory or an idea who had played a role in an environment, a tribe, which didn't have either of our best interests in mind. Family dynamics are micropolitics at its primal best. They're a magnifying glass of the human condition. Children pine for their parents' attention. They rely on them for food, care, and a safe home. And if they're not provided with those things, they learn how to survive through the tactics, behaviors, and manipulations they see exampled before them. Siblings will either bond or turn on each other. And when they've been groomed without self-recognition or awareness, they can repeat the pattern as adults. But becoming vulnerable, understanding acknowledgement, and opening up a pathway for truth and awareness will inherently begin a healing process for the person who emerges out of domestic abuse. It can mend relationships and create belonging. Author and research professor at the University of Houston, Brene Brown, said during her first Netflix talk, belonging is belonging to yourself first, speaking your truth, and then never betraying yourself for other people. True belonging doesn't require you to change who you are, whereas fitting in is an assimilation to the group or tribe. Further, belonging creates inclusion, allows for our differences, healing between people or people groups. It gives meaning to understanding others and allows for a sense of human fault in others. It is the birthplace of redemption, reconciliation, and then the building of unity for what we call community. Fitting in is often exclusionary and establishes you versus me or us versus them. It creates people who are mirrors of each other rather than allow for the unique artistry of each human being. But fitting in is also a twisted version of belonging. So much it is hard to distinguish between the two. It creates war where conflict resolution may be possible. It creates dissent and anger, assessment and assumption. It does not acknowledge the other's needs or wants. It does not hold space for the other to speak a fragile truth or express a need. Only acceptance and belonging can create restoration. In the aftermath of the war-torn environment, the one my sister and I survived, we craved a sense of belonging and healing and tenderness, much like the Iraqi people crave now. When the bombs stop and a breath is taken, there's room for reconciliation. The irony is that reunion happened just weeks after I finally stepped out of Iraq to a place I could finally breathe and in a space where I could discover a resurgence of love and a place that would offer me rest and perspective. So that's the end of that chapter. I would love to talk to Halan first and foremost. The beginning of that chapter starts with a story I was with you on, and what your thoughts and remembrances of that day are. Oh, y'all gotta unmute yourselves.
Yeah, I did. That day or like this day or a lot of other days, I might have, like I could say, not forgotten, but not remember every day. But when I read through your book, that day came up again in my mind, and I remember every second of that day and a lot of other days, because what we experienced in Mosul and during the military operations was outrageous. And every day we would hear stories of like of families, what they've been through, or how did they lose one of their family members in the battle, in the bombardment. And specifically for that day, I remember the story of when we were listening to the Daesh fighters talking to each other on the walkie-talkie, and the Iraqi special forces had caught on their frequency somehow. And we were listening to that guy when he basically he was driving that V-bed towards the Iraqi forces and to blow up himself to the Iraqi forces, where we were with one of their teams. But thankfully, he couldn't manage, and somehow God saved us or another team of the Iraqi forces, and he couldn't blow it up in time, or he couldn't reach us. But we could hear that he was trying to call his other militias or his other ISIS members and trying to blow it up. He was desperate to blow it up to us or to other Iraqi soldiers, but thankfully it didn't happen. And the funny thing is that the Iraqi soldiers were were laughing at him that he's that eager to do it, but he can't do it because we destroyed his car before he get to us.
I'm curious, you know, one of the interesting things is, you know, I know that you were really new to this whole scene because I think you had just come out of university or you had been working other jobs when a bunch of us sort of bombarded into Iraq. And I think for a lot of people, they don't get to see faces like yours very often because you guys are working for a bunch of us. I'd love to just kind of hear and have you share just a little bit of your experience coming in as this fixer producer, as this person who comes in working for a bunch of bumbling journalists. What is that like for you on your end? How, you know, do you find us crazy? Do you find us, you know, like what is your perception of all of this, and how did you? Who was the first journalist that you stepped in and worked with?
I was still, when it started in 2016, I was still studying university, but first journalist I worked with was Heather Murdoch, VOA's correspondent, a good friend and colleague. But when I came into fixing, which is basically arranging meetings, phone calls, or knowing where to go, where's the battle happening, because basically everyone except soldiers and militias, soldiers and militants are running away from where the battle is happening, except journalists. We are running, we are driving to where it happens and eager to find out where it's happening to tell the story of that day and that area. But when it started, I was new to I have heard battle and fighting because my family or my cousins are Peshmerga and they've been fighting, and I've heard their horrible stories, experiences. But from my point of view, this was the harshest thing that a human being can do to other human beings just because you don't agree on one idea. It's inhumane, the most inhumane thing that has happened ever. And for the journalists like Ash and a lot of others who are working in the area, for some reason I would think sometimes that it's crazy for them to travel all the way from their countries of origin to come to Mosul and like risk your. I am from here. I understand. Like I have no choice. I live like 60 kilometers next to Mosul, or I go there because it's my work and it's close. But why would you come all the way from America or European countries, risk your life, and abandon that nice life over there and come to this war, basically? But it's craziness, and it's out of the personality that such journalists have to tell, to risk their lives for on behalf of the world, to tell the stories correctly and from their point of view what has happened there. And I think it's crazy, but we are all crazy, and no matter what, we go there, and it's true, we sometimes push our luck, but thank God still our luck has been very good, and hopefully it will continue like that.
How is Mosul different for you in the sense that you've obviously experienced conflict most of, a lot of your life? There's the 2003 and 2005, 2006, and so on and so forth. And so I'm curious, just, how do you feel Mosul was different, other than the fact that you were fairly involved with a lot of us doing amazing work, but like, how did it feel different for you? Because, it seemed to feel different for a lot of the journalists out there. Even journalists that I had spoken to at the time who had been doing this for 30 years said it was a different kind of war than they had ever covered. And I'm just curious, being an Iraqi, being a Kurdish Iraqi, how you felt in that space.
Well, if you are an Iraqi, or secondly, if you are Kurdish from Iraq, my age, my generation, you have spent all of your life in war, and basically you have to make the best out of it because we are from here. But from all the wars that has occurred in this area since the 90s, since the late 80s to this day, it has been a war, but those wars has occurred between two forces, between countries, and it was not as brutal, as harsh as the one happened in 2016 at liberation of Mosul, because during liberation the amount of weapons and ammunition was used was extremely huge, and the brutality of ISIS against civilians, which in other wars has not happened as much as this one, it was totally different. In this war, much, if we compare to the previous ones, a very, very large number, hundreds of thousands of civilian people was killed by ISIS for no reason, and a lot of babies was orphaned, a lot of wives got widowed, a lot of even a lot of husbands got widowed because their wives died in the bombardment, or just because ISIS think you are a spy and giving information to Peshmerga or to Iraqi forces or to counter-terrorism units. We just lost, at this war, we lost a lot of pure souls that had nothing to do with ISIS, and I hope they are in heaven now because they were innocent, and I think all of it should be blamed on ISIS because of the way that they thought what Islam is, and everyone should follow their version of Islam. It's not even what they think it is. So it was pity what happened. I'm very sorry.
Well, I appreciate that you're here, and I appreciate for all the work that you did for us. Halan worked for us a lot. He worked for quite a few of us a lot. I know you had a couple journalists you probably worked with more, but the fact that you were always out there with us, you were always consistent, you were on it all the time. I mean, I don't think I remember any time that I could come into you, ask a question, and you didn't have something in your pocket already. And so we really appreciated, how much you did for us. And I certainly am deeply grateful for all of that. So thank you so much. I do want to lean over into Matt a little bit, because I did tell a story in the chapter when we went to Alshora, and I was actually with Matt that day. And I know that we've talked about, some of the different things that happened with that. And I kind of just want to get sort of your reflections and perspectives in this space. I mean, to be honest with you, I would have not been able to do Iraq in the first place without, the NGO, and I certainly am very grateful, but really it was really you, because I spent about 10 months talking to you before I showed up. I had learned of the organization through a Rubble weekend conference in California. And then I went and looked them up when I got back to Beirut and started talking to you. And we would Skype like once a month and try and figure it out until I finally kind of came up with a plan to actually show up. And so, yeah, I'd love to hear just some of your reflections in the space.
Well, I love how you say talking to as though it wasn't you, like basically not taking no for an answer and emailing me. And I was like, who is this woman and why won't she leave me alone? And I'm grateful that you didn't, because of this. Look where we are getting to talk now. That's a lot to reflect on, though. So where would you say
Start
I
with
should?
Alshora.
Okay.
Yeah.
That day is still kind of scrambled in my brain. There are a lot of days in Iraq like that. We originally went to check in on some of the work that we were doing as a humanitarian organization. Almost every organization at the time was back in the safe zones, but almost all the need was not in the safe zones. It was more along the front lines and in these sort of no man's land, hinterland type areas. But people wouldn't go there. Huge risk, all that stuff. And so it just felt wrong, immoral. Like, I don't just mean kind of wrong. Like, it felt very wrong for us to hang back when so many people weren't able to reach us. And I remember like the UN and several others, UN, who is that? That's a giant organization, but certain spokespeople for certain very large organizations were not too thrilled that the refugees weren't managing to make it to their nice camps that they had put together. Almost like affronted. Like we invested millions of dollars in these camps, and the IDPs, the displaced people from Mosul and Nineveh and all over, they're not coming. So where are they? Well, they were still trapped in the in-between, whether it was the Peshmerga or the Hashd al-Sha'bi. The militia forces were not allowing people en masse to reach safety. And you can see why. I mean, they were concerned over their own safety and the safety of their citizens. And so if these are actually ISIS sympathizers, then what is that going to mean for the actual places that are safe, right? So there's just this fear all around of who's with whom and who's with ISIS and who's not. And so you get all this suspicion and really simple stories getting thrown around, which is, what happens when you're trying to survive. And our organization just decided to hell with that. Like, we're going to them. There were others who did this too, but there were not many, sadly. And so, Ash, I think that was intriguing to you at the time. And so you kind of tagged along and came with us. And we were checking out a food supply depot, which I actually saw a video clip somewhere on someone's desktop, maybe on Victoria's or someone's, of my former boss standing in front of the food. And but one of the things that we were always trying to push is essentially, I mean, we don't want to do anything that's just outright stupid, but trying to understand, what does it look like to try to help in these kinds of environments? What does it look like to care for people in a frontline kind of context? And to be completely honest, I mean, I'm a kind of rural bumpkin Texas kid who ended up in Iraq wanting to help people. And the next thing you know, we're like being shot at. So it's like, oh, okay. I some of this was just, we were just taking one step at a time and didn't necessarily know what the next step was going to be. But we had a man with us who essentially acted as a fixer, but for like nonprofit. So he's a fixer basically. But and he was willing to take us a little bit closer just to give us a sense of what hell is like. And so we just kind of kept going, and eventually we ended up in Shura. And I just remember we rolled up on that checkpoint and there was all that gunfire, and the soldiers just looked at us and he was like, bunch of white people, are you lost? And it's one of those things where it was so like unnerving, you almost just kind of have to laugh at it. But we got there and eventually they came out and they took us in, and like you said, there were just corpses everywhere. And it was one of the most, there were quite a few dystopian experiences along the front lines of Iraq and then afterwards in Syria, but for me at least. But I would say that was up there in terms of just sickening. I don't think I've been in many more other situations where it felt like humanity of people involved, including myself, was so stripped away, so that we weren't people. There were no good guys and bad guys. It didn't feel that way anymore. Of course, you can tell yourself that story. Oh, ISIS are the bad guys. That's the easy story. And there's a way to tell it where it's truthful. But at least for me, being in it, it was just a complete removal of any sense of we're all human. Like I didn't feel human. Looking around, the people didn't feel human. I don't know any other way to describe it. It was deeply sickening and saddening. So I guess I could go a little more in depth with that or share something else.
I do think one of the stories you told, and I actually liked the way that you told it, but you shared a story with me the other night that I hadn't necessarily forgotten, but I guess I didn't quite bring into the space. And that was, we were in a place that was hell. And yet somehow there was some strange comedy that occurred in the moment that we entered the room with the police. We sat down to talk to them and get some information from them and figure out what they were doing. And Al-Shura was supposed to be cleared, but it wasn't. And I kind of thought that your sort of remembrance of that moment, of what we were sort of experiencing in that moment, kind of that silent reaction, was kind of worth its weight in gold.
Yeah, that was definitely a standout moment. So there have been so many situations like this in Iraq, and then I also experienced it some in Syria and Somalia and some other pretty rough conflict zones where when I first encountered this, it was really borderline offensive to me, but that was just because I had no clue and ultimately had to realize, oh, I just need to slow down and listen here rather than being confused or offended by this. But I remember, well, let me back up. So I remember one time sitting with a sheikh. He was in Suleimania in Kurdistan, but he's originally from the south of Iraq. And I remember he and a bunch of his friends had fled for their lives, and they were taking the time to remember some of their other sheikh friends who had been targeted by ISIS. They're Sufi, which is kind of a more mystical offshoot of Islam. I love it. It's beautiful, but they were very much persecuted. And they showed me on their phone a list that ISIS had released in order of importance of the sheikhs who were to be killed, no questions asked. And there was a bounty on their heads. Most of them were from Fallujah, and most of them managed to make it out, but they were sitting around remembering some of the friends who didn't make it out, and they were going through the list. And I just remember feeling like such a weight as these men, turbans and the whole get up, just very regal leaders in their communities, tribal, religious, ethnic leaders. And I just remember they were going around and talking about the list, and they were remembering names, and it was somber. And then one of the most senior men said, I still can't believe they put you higher on the list than me. I'm so much more important. Look at my beard. It's gorgeous. And he can barely grow a beard. He's a boy. And they rank him higher. Like, they started cracking jokes. And in the moment, I was like, this is really morbid. But like, when you're sitting there and you're in that moment, Halan's laughing because he gets it, but like, I didn't get it. Like, so when you're sitting there and you're in that moment, you really have two options. You can just sort of fall off a cliff into some kind of nihilistic despair, or you can just laugh. Like, what else are you going to do? And so fast forward to Shura, there were so many moments like that, but this is one with you, Ash, where I just remember we looked at each other, but we're in this police station. And the police, unfortunately, are in a situation wherein they are having to act as military. And because the actual military had moved on closer to the actual Mosul city limits. And so we're in Shura. And I just remember we were sitting there on the couch, and you and I are kind of off in a corner or whatever, kind of paying attention or whatever, but very much just like, what's going on? How did we end up here? why are we here? What's happening right now? And I just remember there was clearly some kind of bomb. I couldn't tell if it was an airstrike. I wasn't sure. I don't have like a trained ear necessarily. Was it a mortar round? But it turns out it was a suicide bomber, and there were only a few confirmed ISIS fighters left in the community, and they were clearing them. And there was this pretty large explosion, and I just remember we kind of felt it. And I looked over at you, Ash, and then I looked over at this sergeant, and I'm pretty sure he was a sergeant, but he was this kind of short guy, and he was just sitting down on the end of the couch, and he just looked over at me, and he just goes, like, with this ridiculous face. A man had just blown himself up. It's a horrifying reality, but in the midst of that, we're just sitting there, and there's this quirky, goofy little sergeant, and he's making this goofy face. It was just weird, like how many conflicting emotions you can end up having in that kind of environment. It's almost like your limbic system and your brain is trying to figure out what emotion fits this situation, and it just doesn't know, because it's like, this is crazy. What are we supposed to feel or think about any of this? And then after we had actually gotten back to Kurdistan or wherever it was that we went next, like, I just remember then all these emotions flooded of like what I kind of feel like I was supposed to feel or think in that moment. But like I didn't, it's almost like my brain had to catch up, because so like what that guy did now, I look back at it and I can still kind of giggle, because it's like his face was just comically toad-like. I don't know how else to describe it. But then
there's a moment of laughter and lament.
All the corpses. Sorry?
I said there's just a moment of laughter and lament that happens. Like the laughter kind of happens first as the coping mechanism, and then your body catches up and going, oh, that's actually a really terrible thing. But I think that it's our way. And to be honest with you, I think it's in a Rocky way. Like when I reflect on just the Middle East, and I reflect on Iraq, and I listen and I watch Iraqi people, they're hilarious, because they find that niche to laugh about the worst of circumstances, because it helps them survive, and it is morbid. It's not that it's not morbid. It's not that there's not grieving or mourning that has to happen or whatever, but
totally
without a sense of laughter, I think that we would all be far more destitute.
I mean, one of the things I've started saying is sometimes you need to laugh to be able to get to grief. Like a loved one dies, and sometimes you need to be able to just sit around and tell goofy stories of crazy stuff they used to do or say. And then that helps you kind of get through to the harder stuff, but it's almost like a door. And I don't know, I'm grateful for those moments. There's so many moments with Iraqis, Kurds, Arabs, whoever, like they're just the most resilient and profoundly beautiful people I have ever encountered in my life. And I lived there for 8 years, and if I could, I would go back right now. I love it so much. I'm so grateful for those moments. Yeah, that was one of those lessons where it's like, oh, what?
I said, you're welcome anytime you come back.
Spas welcome.
Kaka.
Jim, I'd love to be able to have you step in too, because I know that these moments that Halan and Matt and I are talking about, are things that you've definitely experienced for a very long time. You've covered the region. You were in Beirut during the Civil War. You were in that entire area, Iraq, Beirut, everything. So I'm kind of curious what your reflection is in all of this. Looking at it now, understanding where it's come, for better and worse. I mean, you have such an incredible career that's, taking you through all these places, and it's changed and not changed in other ways.
Well, it certainly has. I bet, first of all, let me say this, that I found your book on one hand very descriptive of what it's like to be the journalist out, a real story about what it's like to be a journalist, especially a freelance journalist working in war zones. And at the same time, a very personal story, spiritual story, a story that you open up in. And it was moving, and it just had that real feel. And I hope that people who are watching this really pick up your book, because I think it's a different book about journalism and journalists. Certainly, listening to Halan and listening to Matt, great stories about, there's something about war. Yes, it brings out the worst in people, but it also brings out the best. and you find people that are truly unforgettable wherever you go in the world, whether it's in Somalia, whether it's in the Congo, whether it's in, the Middle East wars or the Bosnia war, things like this. You find people that truly stand out and inspire you, and you take that with you. You have to take away the positive, because otherwise, and you talk about this a lot, the damage, the post-traumatic stress that you get from doing this. It's not easy, and it's not easy to go through it. It's not easy, to lose someone. Thank God I've never lost anyone that I was working with, but we've had colleagues that did. And it's a very tough thing. Times have changed, and it's tougher on freelancers now than it has ever been. A lack of support from any organized news agency, and they tend to use people up, let them absorb the danger. And the networks did this on a regular basis too. Halan should know and have experienced that they'll push the local staff out there. They'll push them to take risks that they won't subject their own people to, who they've given medical coverage and emergency care and things like this. And so the network journalists must take care of the local journalists. First of all, we need them to survive. We can't tell the story without them, let's face it. Whether it's not just translating, it's knowing the streets. There was a study in Bosnia where all of the casualties, or like 78% of the casualties, were in the first 48 hours. Why? Because people would fly in, they had no idea about where they were, had no idea about the streets, and they would go to places where they should not have gone. They were too dangerous, but they were too stupid to know it. And one of the worst things that can happen is to be hooked up with someone who tells you, and Lord knows I've had it, where they say, it's all right. I'll do anything. I'm not afraid. Well, as I told one guy, if you're not afraid, you're too stupid to work with me, because you've got to be afraid. That's what keeps you alive in all of this. Things have changed now so much in the news industry that I think it's more hazardous than it's ever been for people. I think I've got to confess, I didn't have war zone training, security training. If you had gotten wounded with me, it's just by the grace of God that I didn't have somebody wounded with me, because Lord knows we came close so many times. Snipers' bullets hitting, doing a stand-up, and a sniper's bullet comes ripping in. We came so close. But if you had a sucking chest wound, all I could have done was hold your hand, because I had not a clue what to do. I had no war zone training. I had no medical training at all. And I look back on it and I say, good Lord, that was stupid.
In the conversation, thank you very much for that. Thank you so much. It's interesting to me, because when I was going out in the field in 2012, at the time, the person who was the head of CNN security, and he had actually gone out with Arwa and a few of those from the CNN team, but he had done a kind of a freelance ragtag hostile environment training in Tennessee. And so a bunch of us clobbered up there, and we spent 4.5 days getting sort of basic medic training and running through the woods and learning all of that stuff. And then I kind of did a refresher when I was in Iraq with a number of my colleagues and friends. And it was becoming in 2012, it was becoming kind of a thing. And now we're having the discussion among at least a lot of freelancers. We're having a lot of conversation where we're saying, okay, the training stuff's there. That's great. Now we've got some basic training, but we might want to talk about the psychological stuff that happens afterwards, because that has never been an enormous conversation. I do know that in CNN, that's a conversation that's probably been going on for a long time. I remember at the height of Syria in 2012, there had been an attack on a village where a number of children and people had been slaughtered. And I do remember, at the time, an editor had gone to the international desk and said, I can't edit this. I can't do this. And so the head of our desk said, okay, well, we'll get someone else, and we understand, and kind of assigned each one of us a day on the desk so we would take turns and have a break. But there's still, even over these years, within the wider journalist community, there's not enough conversation about the care afterwards. Marie Colvin, who is a hero of mine, still at the same time died because her mental capacity kept her there one more day.
Her desire, she had to be on the story. Listen,
kind of that addiction.
Colvin was my dear friend, and we covered so many stories together, beginning with the Intifada in Gaza and in the West Bank. And Marie and I were together. I remember we did an interview with Arafat, and we were the only ones out of perhaps 200 journalists. In the end, we got the interview with Arafat. You know why? Because we stayed there until 3 o'clock in the morning, knowing that if Arafat promised us we'd get an interview, we'd get the interview. You just had to outwait him. And Marie said to me at the time, she said, Jim, I'll hate it because tomorrow they'll say, Clancy and Colvin got the interview because Arafat likes them. And she said, look around. Who's still here? Marie Colvin stuck with the story. And one of the things that was terrible about the kidnappings in Beirut in the early 1980s, mid 1980s, was that every time a journalist got kidnapped, they were denigrated by their fellow journalists. Oh, he shouldn't have been there. He shouldn't have been doing that. It was a bad idea. Let me tell you, that's just the journalist's way of saying, oh, it couldn't happen to me. It can happen to you.
And I don't disagree with you. In fact, because I honor her so much in the work that she did. I think one of the conversations that's beginning to come up among younger journalists is how much of this is an addiction and how much we need to maybe take care of ourselves so that we can be better journalists or be better storytellers.
It's an adrenaline rush, and you get addicted to it and you want to go into it and you take risks you shouldn't. People ask me, what's the most dangerous place you've ever been? You know what the most dangerous place is? It's the empty road. Because you look down that road and the locals that live there, they're not on that road. Why? What do they know that you don't, since you don't know anything? And you have to take your salary. You have to cut out everything for taxes and everything else that you pay. And then you have to divide it by 250, the number of working days. And look at that number when you get to the bottom and say, am I going to take myself down that road for this much money? And 9 times out of 10, or maybe 10 times out of 10, you go, it's not worth it. It's just not worth it. We take incredible risks, crazy risks, and we subject others who we work with to those same crazy risks. And yeah, it's an addiction. It definitely is. And you have to break it off at some point. Some people do better at it than others.
I hope that that's a message we can share with people in that sense, because, I remember there were times that I would get anxious and be, oh my God, I need to be at this place, or I need to be at this place, not just in Iraq, but, it took me a little extra time to get into Gaza, or to the extra story that was on the Lebanese border, or whatever was going on. And I did have a few mentors and older journalists who would be like, the story's going to be there. There's going to be another war tomorrow. Don't rush. And I think sometimes we get into this business, or we jump out into the field, and obviously the older you get, the more you learn. But I think sometimes when you jump out, it's that there's almost that adrenaline rush, that addiction that happens. And we have to kind of teach ourselves to be able to say, oh, wait a minute, the story will still be there, or there'll be a different one. Sometimes you have to care for the self in order to be able to shift into a way of thinking about it, because if you don't ever stop, then you're going to become, I think, it'll affect your work. Even me writing the book, I had a friend of mine who told me, he said, you have to step away from this place to really write about it the way that you want to. And he was right. He was very right. So,
Ash,
anyway, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in to say, I think you hit on it, just an incredibly, incredibly important point. Jim and I have been in the business through the whole period from analog to digital before the internet was there, and all the addictive aspects of being a journalist, being on the scene, seeing these things, even as traumatic as all these things that we see in person are, there's an addictive quality to those. But then when you introduce the internet and then introduce social media to that, and this need, this feeding, this addiction to be connected to it all the time, and this feeling that you describe of not wanting to miss something, not wanting to be disconnected from it, and actually feeling guilt that if you divert your attention from it just for a minute, that you've dedicated yourself to this, then that feeds an addiction again. It's so important to maintain, try to maintain a balance, trying to maintain distance, try to take emotional break, psychological break. I have a daughter who's in the industry now, works for a social media news gathering organization.
God help her.
Yeah, and it's very, very difficult when you introduce the intensity and the volume of imagery of social media into the equation, that repetitive traumatic imagery, and then at the same time dealing with people who are taking these traumatic images, and you're in contact with them, so you're exposed to their trauma as well.
Here's a true story about that, Eli.
Go ahead, Jim.
Truckers were offered what they thought would be fabulous salaries to go to Iraq and drive trucks for the U.S. military. Well, as preparation, they got the videos off of YouTube that showed other truckers being executed by ISIS, or at that time it was ISIS, Al-Qaeda. And they watched these videos over and over again. They staged it so that, how would we get out? How would you, get the knife and get yourself untied? And of course, there was no way to do it. But these guys literally installed PTSD on themselves by absorbing those videos nonstop and then trying to act out what they would do to get out of that mess. It was insane. And they got PTSD out of it.
I think that's the other thing too, is that to me, and I actually talk about this in another chapter, but I think that PTSD is unexpressed grief. That ultimately it's what gets lodged into you and sort of sticks with you. And unless we begin to have conversations about how to process those emotions, whether it be through laughter, it can be through laughter, it can be through mourning, it can be through therapy, it can be through other activities. There's a myriad of ways to work with, the conversation around mental health as it concerns these things. And certainly people across Iraq and Syria are in desperate need of those resources as well. But it's something that, unless we begin to have those conversations about unpacking that grief, PTSD then just becomes this disorder, the stickler, and so many people are afraid of it. And in some places, people even shun another person, or they treat them as different, or even our veterans feel so stuck with things where they don't know how to overcome certain issues, and they end up homeless, they end up with families that are broken apart, and so forth. So we have to begin to have conversations about how we deal with not just those addictions, but we deal with those griefs, how we can insert laughter, community purpose into those spaces. Whether you walk away from the war zone or whether you continue in your journalist career, there has to be outlets for that. I do think that maybe more now than ever that those conversations are becoming a little more acceptable, but there's still stigmas that are attached. And I think we need to break that, because there has to be a journey of overcoming that to come to a sense of our own healing, our own oneness, our own community, whatever you believe in, whether you're a spiritual person or not, it doesn't really matter. It's just about being able to come back to your own sort of personal sacred self. And that, this is a journey that often doesn't always allow for that. And my hope is that we can change that conversation, because I don't feel like the story can stay as just a stagnant story. You've got to move it somewhere.
I'm really curious to know what Halan and Matt, in your experiences, how have you managed this? this PTSD and this stress of being right in the heart of the situation. Halan?
I'm gonna let Matt go. I'm still processing it.
Okay.
You know, I think I couldn't see what was happening to me. I needed someone outside to see for me, because I had lost perspective in such a significant way. So I don't know how much to get into that, but essentially for me, it was my wife. Basically, she was there with me. We lived in Iraq with our kids. We lived in Kurdistan. Sorry, we've got a Kurd on the call, and be respectful. But we lived in Kurdistan for about 8 years, and I think it was those few years around the ISIS crisis that something started shifting, but I wasn't aware of it until I was sort of way down the hole. And that's whenever my wife just said, no, like you need to get therapy. I don't need therapy. Yes, she never does this. She never makes demands. We are always having an open conversation and working really hard toward a kind of egalitarianism. But she just told me, no, like, we're not doing that here. You are going to get help. And that's why I'm in San Diego right now and not in the Middle East. It's because she said it's time to go get healthy. Like we need it, you know, because the secondary, either the primary or even the secondary, and even in some ways the tertiary trauma, which is a new concept, it was just recently introduced to me. That was sort of, I was just a sponge soaking it up in ways that I didn't even realize. And then I'm becoming a source of secondary trauma for my own children, who are very malleable 1 and 2 and 3-year-olds, right? And so I could see what was happening to me affecting them, and they don't even know what a Mosul is, you know? And so I think seeing the way that pain flows like water, and the way that it has to be dealt with, not necessarily dealt out, as we've seen, right? Just sort of returning pain for pain, eye for an eye, but choosing to figure out ways to let it stop with you and to deal with it yourself, so that you don't then transmit it on to someone else and continue these cycles of trauma that ultimately contribute to hate and all these systemic problems we know of. So for me, it was just my wife putting her foot down and saying, no, to hell with this, we're going to go get healthy. And that's what I needed. And I'm happier than I've ever been in my whole life right now. So
well, thank God.
I mean, that's not to say it wasn't joyful there, but
yeah,
I'm really, really incredibly grateful for her.
Yeah.
Sorry, I am too. I think Kayla has been, I know, a strength for you and a rock for you through a lot of waves of trying to navigate this space. And so I'm grateful for your wife too. In helping with all of that. I do want to open up the floor a little bit for any questions that folks might have around either things that we are talking about or things that were brought up in the chapter that haven't been talked about. I don't know if Mookie or Rob had a question or some commentary they wanted to share. I know they've jumped in on the Zoom. And so or if not, or if any of you guys have any thoughts or questions that you guys wanted to add that we haven't jumped on or stepped on yet.
Well, let me jump in then and ask you this, because you make this book so personally. I mean, you disassemble yourself a little bit as you're doing this, your family and everything else, as you look at these issues, you know, the whole tribes chapter, as you're looking at it all. How did you come to the conclusion that that belonged in this book? Because it makes it so much more personal than other war correspondence accounts that I've read.
So I think that as I was processing Mosul, even in Mosul, or even while I was in Iraq, I began to realize that, and it wasn't necessarily my first war zone, I think it was just the most expansive one that I had been in. And I was realizing how much I already knew, just on an emotional level. And I didn't feel like there was any other way I could tell it. You're right. I've read a lot of other war correspondent books and memoirs, and they're good and they're fascinating and they're incredible storytellers. But I think that because I felt like, for me, I didn't come into the journalism field in being inspired by journalists. I came into the journalism field being inspired by playwrights and music and film and fictional storytellers, and wanting to take the elements of that into my own life. In the first chapter, I refer to a man who by the name of John, who had actually been my youth pastor, and when I got a little bit older, he was a mentor. And he was the very first person that I told that I wanted to be a war correspondent. And I was 19 years old, and he said yes. Like, there's a lot of other crazy things I could have said that I wanted to do with my life, but it was that one. And he didn't tell me no. And it was the first time somebody in my life, a mentor in my life, was like, okay, let's figure out how we get you there. And I think that set the course for just how I see the world, how I view the world, and even how I view the war zone. I was influenced a lot by, I mentioned in the book several times, I was influenced a lot by MASH and syndication, which is one of the most human shows that talks about war ever. You know, Alan Alda did an incredible job scripting that show and participating in that show. And I think those influences influenced me. And so I think writing a book, writing a piece that reflected the way that, you know, we can all tell war stories, but each person can only tell it the way they can tell it. The only way that I can tell it is to take you into the world that influenced me to get there in the first place. You know, Jim, you're going to write it in a way that's going to be only the way that you can tell it.
My stories keep getting better the older I get.
Exactly. And
No,
Matt
that's
and
what
Don, and you know what I mean?
That's
the
one of
only
the
way I
things.
could tell it was that way.
One of the things that I really appreciated in your book was the fact that you didn't lean into that the way that so many others had. I mean, look, we all know there are some correspondents out there. It's no joke. They write lines like, I stepped around the corner, the stench of cordite hung in the air, and then I heard the rat-a-tat-tat and saw the baklava-clad gunman firing straight at me. I ducked and covered and into a ditch, and I rolled into the alley. And I approached him, and, you know, I'm reading this, and I said, hey, excuse me, I was with you all day long. This never effing happened. Literary license. I mean, some people use war as a way to go off on their own. They like to work on their own because they see stuff that the rest of the journalists never see. And then you start getting rockets from Atlanta, New York, wherever, London, wherever your base of operations is, and you have to compete with these people. And they're just making it up whole cloth. And this book doesn't make it up. I mean, there's such a sense of realism to it, the way that you unfold it. And I appreciated that. Your honesty.
Well, thank you. I'm really glad that you yeah.
Hey, Ash. I just want to read we've got a question on YouTube right now. So I just want to read this question. And it's coming from Justine. And Justine wants to ask Halan. Justine says, I would be very interested to still hear Halan's view and experience on PTSD, if he would like to share it a bit, and how he feels about people coming in and out while he's staying because it's his home. Do you want to share, Halan?
My mic was off. I'm sorry. Yeah, I was also reading her question. It's interesting. So first, let me answer how I feel about people coming in and out while I am, or people like me, stay because it's our home. I think sometimes I would be jealous of people who can just go somewhere, have a life that you don't hear gunfire, you don't hear bombardment, you're not afraid of what's going to happen tomorrow, you're not afraid of what's news about US, Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, politics, and how how this is going to influence your life tomorrow. But with all of these, I am still very honored to be from here, to be a Kurdish, to be from Kurdistan, to be from this part of the region, because I love us, and it's very, I don't know, it's very emotional to tell it in words, and it's hard, but I think I love it being from here, and I love it. Yeah, I love it being from here. About the her first question was if my experience on PTSD. My experience on PTSD, I don't know what exactly to tell her or other audience, because I think it didn't have as much as influence on me, because I was born in war, during wartime. I was raised during wartime. I have spent most of my childhood during wartime, and again when I'm an adult and working in this field. For example, I remember in 2003 when the invasion happened of 2003, taking down Saddam Hussein. I was at elementary school, and when the battle was happening, me and the other kids in the neighborhood, there were a lot of bullets, a lot of explosive materials around, and basically we grew up playing with explosives. So I think I'm kind of used to it, and it feels home for me.
My friend, that is a very profound way to fade out of that, to talk about growing up playing with bombs. Because that's, I mean, there is a part of me that I have to sit here and say that as an American, I feel like I have to take some sense of strange ownership of the fact that we've participating in the destruction of your country, and it's not okay. You know, I know that Iraq has certainly had its own wars and conflicts, and you know, the Iraq-Iran war, and you know, all those things have existed, right? People have been fighting wars for thousands of years, right? That's not new. But you know, I know that in the past, 17 years, really, that a significant amount of the influence and destruction that has occurred, there's been a lot of involvement with the US that has done that. And I've seen the airstrikes and the things that have been left behind. And so, you know, I want you to know that I don't think that it's okay, that the Iraqi people deserve better, that no child should have to grow up like playing with bombs shouldn't be normal. Like that just shouldn't be normal. You know, I remember seeing kids like crawling on broken, bombed out cars and stuff like that. And so, you know, I know that Iraqi people do a very good job moving through that space. You know, you guys have a resilience that is beyond anything that I understand sometimes. But, you know, in order to honor you, I have to say, you know, as an American, like, it's not okay. And our country has not been okay for its participation and its lack of rebuilding. And so you need to know that, because I just think that the Kurds and the Iraqis, y'all just deserve better.
Well, the American taxpayers got screwed as well. I just want to say this to Halan. I mean, you weren't old enough to remember the Iran-Iraq war, but it was a brutal, grinding war that went on forever. And one of my most distinct images was at less than a year later, going to Baghdad and seeing all the baby strollers. Everybody was back. There was no war. People were celebrating life itself. And then suddenly it all returns. And that was the wrong that was committed. The Iraqi people did not deserve what was visited upon them. And, you know, the arms manufacturers, everybody talks about how brutal it's become. It's pushed there because arms are available. Yes, Kalashnikov invented the AK-47 that made 12-year-olds into fighters and made child soldiers a reality. But it's these massive weapons that are sold all the time to governments and pushed by the international arms dealers. And the United States is the leading one. Our companies are the ones who sell all of this stuff, and that enables war. That's what makes it so deadly for civilians. And make no mistake, when there's a war, it's the civilians that pay the price.
Very true. When there's any war anywhere, the only people who suffer are civilians and no one else. It's a big lie when politicians or big companies or whoever like abroad says, oh, this war has affected us in so many ways. Maybe it has had like side effects to your personal or company benefits, but the suffer here for people or for civilians everywhere else in this world. Suffer is not just losing money or not making any money. Suffer is not being able to live a life that you deserve. Suffer is not living in a peaceful life that you don't like. Now I can distinguish between, like, if I hear a gunfire outside my home, across the window right now, I can tell if it's an AK-47, if it's an M4, if it's an M16, or if there's a bombardment because of all the experience, because of what we have been through. I can tell if it's an artillery or if it's a mortar, or I should not know that.
I agree. You shouldn't know that. You shouldn't know that. And I think that's the thing is that, you know, there's a comic that I like where the young boy in the comic, he tells his favorite stuffed tiger, he's all dressed up in his military uniforms, and his stuffed tiger says to him, he says, why do we always play war games? Why don't we play peace games? And the kid responds, not enough examples. You know, and it's a very telling comic, but it's so true because there's just not enough examples. We definitely have far more. I will say this though, and I'll use this as a transition a bit, is that one of the things though is that finding sort of the peace and the calm in the midst of that is a really fascinating thing to me, because when you can find those moments in the turmoil to just create a centeredness for yourself so that you can move through the next day, it really shifts, I think, your perspective. And the reason that I bring this up is because I know Victoria mentioned she had a question about Batmaya, which I know Matt and I both had really, really incredible experiences in. So I wanted to kind of give the floor and hear what you were thinking around it.
Sure. Yeah. So I remember back in 2016 when you posted pictures and video from Batmaya, from the church, and you so eloquently write about the church in your memoir. And I loved that part of the book because I know your turning point, right? That's that moment in that bombed out church that was miraculously still standing, that had bullet holes, and you could tell that the statues had been used for target practice. And you're standing there in this altar and you whispered this silent prayer to yourself. You know, that's how this all started for you. It's almost as if that was the moment where your journey began, right? Of not only, you know, writing your book, but your personal journey. So tell us a little bit about this church, because you describe it so well. I can see it in my mind because I remember the photos, and I actually have some of the photos that I want to share while you're talking about this.
Sure. So, and Matt, you're free to jump in at any point, but this was a story that I went and did because of Matt, actually. So I this is about 3 weeks maybe into the start of the official operation. And I was at dinner with Matt and his lovely wife. And while preparations were being made, we were sitting in the living room, and they had just come back. The organization had just come back from Batnaya, and Matt got really animated and shared the story because he was so excited about this church, about this place that they got to saw. And they actually were able to have the opportunity to meet one of the priests that had been there and take them into it. There it is. And so I grabbed 2 of my colleagues, and we decided to wing it. And we grabbed somebody who could drive us. And we went to the last Peshmerga. The Peshmerga had liberated this place and taken over this place. And we got to them, and they were like, well, we don't know if we can let you in. So they called their commander. We spent about 2 or 3 hours kind of in the middle of the day waiting at the checkpoint, which was so normal, and waiting for them to get permission to let us go through. And then finally, this commander, he said, look, I'll take you in myself. There's so many IEDs. We don't want you guys to step on anything. We'll take you in ourselves. So he says he'll take us in. And so he got his entourage together, and we got into a little mini caravan between a couple different cars and trucks, and we drive into the edge, and they sort of guided us through some of the rubble to get into the church, and then kind of just gave us freedom to wander the church, talk to the soldiers, take pictures, do whatever we wanted. I was so taken with it because this was an infamous church. This was a church where you had heard about the graffiti. Like, you heard about the graffiti before you got to it. And of course, I know I don't do Matt's stories justice, so he's certainly welcome to step in with his own story, but it was his story that was like, I need to go and do this. We went to the top of the steeple. They ring the bell, they show off, they show how that they freed this place. It was definitely heartbreaking, but there was something really sweet about it because most of these guys were Muslim Peshmerga, and they kept talking about how the Christians were their brothers and sisters and their soulmates. And it's a moment you get to see the beautiful relationship between Muslims and Christians, particularly in the East. And as someone who comes from a Western perspective and who grew up in the Western version of evangelical Christianity, I had already, my mind, my heart, my shift was already taking place. I have not attended a church in many years. I left the institution of the church when I was probably about 22 or 23. I have my own faith journey, my own spiritual journey that's taken place, but there was something about this that it was like, oh, here is the sweetness of that relationship that I don't feel the West understands at all. And yet you see it in this place and you feel it in this place. And there was something, I think, that struck me, and that prayer for most people who don't know was just heal me. Just create that healing space that, I meant to experience. And so, Batnaya was a moment that, even though it was a few weeks into the operation, I definitely think it was a matter of creating my perspective journey, maybe adding to my healing journey. I think we go through grief and healing throughout our life over and over again, but this was kind of a unique element that was maybe created this space, as Jim pointed out earlier, for me to be able to kind of disassemble in a way that I hadn't before, in a way that wasn't always normal for me. And so maybe it had that kind of an impact. But I mean, I will forever say that story was one that I went to because my friends, someone who's, a brother and a friend, has shared the story with me and had their own impact. And so, of course, Matt, I know that this meant a lot to you as well, to see sort of this broken church, but there was something about the love and sweetness in this place that was transcendent, and you could feel it. You could feel, maybe not everybody believes in energies, but I do. And you could feel an energy in that room that was not normal, that was holy, that was sacred, it was just there. So, I mean, Matt, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts.
Is this the Father Aram story?
I think you told me the Father
Akbar?
Aram story. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we were there again trying to it was essentially what we called scouting trips, which was trying to get to sort of more frontline areas to see what it looked like to try to help people go home, which, only a few weeks into the operation, it was obviously very early in the process, but So I was there with a couple of local friends, and we were just with I think we're actually with the Iraqi military. I don't think that we went with the Peshmerga, but so we're kind of walking through, and it's kind of like what Ash said, like it's just so many different feelings and so many different. Talking about faith can be a little confusing, but it was always in Iraq, like that's what you go straight to, and that's really very much a Middle Eastern thing. You can jump into talking about a lot of the stuff that as a kid growing up, I wasn't supposed to talk about, like we're around the dinner table. We're not going to talk about religion and politics too much. And we're going to not talk about these kind of inflammatory things. But you hang out with someone in the Middle East and it's like, hey, let's talk about politics and religion. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I loved that. It was really energizing for me because they just jump straight into like the meat of it. Well, okay, we can talk about the weather if you want. It's really hot. Now let's talk about politics and religion. Like, okay. And so I loved that freedom to talk about some of those things. Obviously, you can't there's a way to do it and there are rules. And it took me a long time to get to where I kind of understood how to approach it. But I just remember walking around with these two priests and just kind of wondering what they were feeling walking through one of the largest churches in their diocese and how it felt. And Father Aram is an extraordinary man. He was telling us, we were talking strategically, right? Tactically, what would it look like? What do people want? What do the numbers say? They've done polls for various groups, Christian, Yazidis, Sunni, Shia, Kurd, Arab, whoever. Like, what do they need to be able to go home and rebuild their life? And so we're asking some of those questions, but I'm just noticing the graffiti, and my Arabic was actually good enough to read most of it. And so, excited, and I'm asking him questions, and I had just been studying a lot. So it's like, I wanted to ask, am I getting that right? Is that what that says? And sometimes I'd be like, no. And then other times I'd be like, yeah, good job. So we're going around and we're asking questions. And I just noticed God is greater, just scrawled sort of all over the church walls and on the pillars. And I said, well, I'm assuming that it wasn't you who put this here. But you as a Christian believe that, right? And he's like, oh, of course. And I said, so when they write it, what is the difference between when ISIS or a militant or an extremist, for example, writes it and for you? And he said, oh, the difference, what makes God great? Why is God great? God is not great because God can dominate and because God can destroy and kill. God is great because God is love. And he got really intense. Like, I don't even do it justice. He got super intense in this. He said, look around. Does this look like greatness? All this destruction, all this death? He said, no. But when you come ready to love, ready to listen, ready to understand, he said, I believe you display the greatness of God. And wherever you're at from a faith perspective, it was just profound for me. For that priest standing in the midst of all that destruction, there are still corpses. We can see the bony corpses of feet sticking out from under cinder blocks and slabs outside of the church, possibly his own congregants. We don't even know. They were still in the middle of DNA testing, and they probably still are. But that moment where he just cut right through so much of it, and for me, it was never a Muslim Christian thing. There are so many Muslims who believe this same thing. God's greatness is in God's mercy, God's love, God's compassion. Yeah. And so it would have been really easy to hear that as a sectarian thing. And I actually have some friends and family in the United States who might have heard it that way. But I did not hear it that way, and I have not experienced that way. It's people who see that the ultimate reality, the ultimate guiding force of the universe is sacrificial love. And that's what he was trying to communicate in the midst of all that pain, that he would still make that statement. And I thought, oh my gosh, like I haven't lost anything by comparison. And to hear his statement, right. and it was almost like he was just passionately preaching to himself, but everyone with us was just like, whoa, like it was a moment for me for sure.
But you turned that moment.
And that's why I got all excited telling you about
it.
I know,
you did, because you like, stood up and you
gotta hear this guy. He's amazing.
But that's transcendence, right? Like that is transcendence to me. And so that played out in not only just my wanting to go see it for myself, but that played out, I think, in the unfolding of everything. of everything else. Thank you for sharing that. We are at a 90-minute mark right now. So I want to, first and foremost, really quickly just see if there's any more. Rob and Mookie, you guys have jumped in here. So I don't know if you guys have any questions or thoughts that you want to share in this space. I'm happy for that to be the case, but I also want to go around and give everybody a chance to, do that. And then of course, everybody gets the last word, and then we'll kind of make our way out. Hi, Rob.
Hey, I don't have a question. I just want to say thank
Sure.
you guys so much for opening up, and this was wonderful.
Thank you for joining us. I'm really glad you're here.
Ash, tell us how we can get the book.
Okay, so right now, here's the thing. I have had conversations with Barnes & Noble. The paperback, inshallah, will be available any day now. They have slowed down on their printing production. I had put out for a proof book weeks ago, and that should have only taken several days. But here we are almost 3 weeks later, and they don't even know where the printing process is. So we're waiting on that proof book before we can put it on order, because they won't even allow you to do that. So I have talked to them. I just talked to them hours ago, and they said, please be patient with us. Our shipping times and printing times have slowed down. I will announce it when the paperback comes out, which again should be anytime. In the meantime, if you are watching and you are interested in reading this book, you can still get it as an ebook. So Barnes & Noble Nook. You can also get it on Apple iTunes, or you can also just go to my site, ashgallagher.com/book, and the buttons to buy the books for the ebook are all right there. And so I would love for you guys to read it. I would love for you guys to tell me what you think about it. I'd love for you guys to also, whatever moves you or challenges you, to talk about in your own stories, right? Like my story is your story. My story is just a human story. And I would rather it be a part of a collective way for us to talk about our humanness and how we heal, how we create healing and justice in our communities, in our personal lives, in our minds, taking the wars abroad and bringing them home, because everybody's had some sort of war within, and we can talk about the different scales of mental or spiritual or physical, but at the same time, I believe that some of those same spaces can apply to our mental health, our intellectual health, our personal health. And so I just encourage everybody to participate with it rather than just read it. And those are the ways that you can get it. Does anybody want to add anything before we slip away?
Well, I'd just like to say thank you, Ash, and I'd like to echo Jim's comments. I think this is a really brave book. I think you took what sometimes is the ultimate risk, is to let yourself be vulnerable, to open yourself up in that way, in such a personal way, and I think that's a remarkable thing. It's a gift, and I also want to say thank you for spreading the message for journalists and for people working for NGOs and people on the ground. We have to take care of each other. We have to take care of ourselves, and the stress and the emotional impact of these things is very real. So thank you for that.
Thank you for all of your help and support. I mean, I can't thank you enough. For those of you who don't know, briefly, I met Eli back in 2005 when I started at CNN, and he and another gentleman at the desk, I met Jim probably around the same time as well, and Victoria not long after that, doing various jobs at CNN. And CNN, a lot of us say that CNN raised us. It was like going to school, like you went to CNN University, because CNN was a place where you could literally go anywhere in the building and anybody would teach you anything you wanted to know. And I fell in love with broadcast, and I fell in love with media on a new level. And I wasn't a skilled journalist. I didn't even really take it in college. I took psychology and international relations classes, and I didn't really have a 4-year degree, and I had worked for some newspapers. So I was kind of just a fumbling young 20-something trying to figure my way out. And CNN folks, and the three of you were part of that, sort of just treated me with dignity and kindness and taught me so much and were so supportive, and I'm so grateful. Jim, I have a lot of gratefulness for you. I mean, when you came to Beirut, not long after I had started there, like you showed up and called me, and we shared drinks, and so I'm really appreciative for all of the people in the field who as well kind of took care of me when I first went out into the Middle East. And so, a lot of gratitude, a significant amount of gratitude.
I just want to say thank you for finishing it, getting it done. I am so proud of you. I mean, people don't, it's a challenge to put something like this together and to do it so well. I think it's must reading for young journalists, especially those who think that they want to go off on that worldwide adventure and have an adventure in their lives, one that takes a lot of risks, because almost all the people that are here have taken those risks, and it's part of life. I mean, that's how you live it. And I just have so much respect for you, and I am just so happy with the way it turned out. Ash, love you. Be good.
Thank you so much, Jim. I appreciate you.
I'm super proud of you, Ash. Super proud. This was a
Thank you.
labor of love. I've kind of been talking to you the entire time, even when you were in a different country when you were working on this. So I know it's taken you a while, and you've proved that you can do hard things, and I'm proud of you.
Merci. Merci. Matt and Halan, I can't thank you guys enough. Halan, you worked your ass off for me and for everybody else, not just me, just everybody else. Like, Halan is somebody, if you are a journalist and you're looking to go to Iraq, this is your guy. And Halan is somebody, some of us, we like to say, like, we raised him up, and kind of helped, sort of mold you and shape you, but you also molded and shaped us and taught us, and we stood corrected sometimes with you, and so it was a mutual effort. So I appreciate you, and know that my heart is with you whether I'm in Iraq or not. That place has my heart, a big part of my heart, and so I appreciate that. And Matt, I appreciate you too, because Iraq really wouldn't have happened without you at all. So
thank you very much. You did a great job, and as Mr. Jim said, you finished it very good. But I want to say, I am sorry for everything happened in this country. Like, I'm sorry on behalf of all the world for what happened here and in a lot of other places. With all of that, with a lot of people losing their family members, journalists losing their lives, fixers losing their lives, or all that destruction, all that injustice, it's past, and what's past we can't change, but what we can do is tell the truth, like what you're doing, and telling the world what's happening here. But with all of that, again, I am grateful to meet amazing people that have came abroad to tell what's happening in my country, what's happening to me and people like me. I appreciate your great efforts, your sacrifice in life, and most importantly, your craziness to do this. And also, I am grateful to meet amazing people. Hopefully, a lot of people might look at us as, Middle Eastern people are terrorists, but no, when you come here and meet us, we want to, not to show off, but to show you we are people, we have blood, we breathe, we love you, and we want to show you our local cuisine, the food, the crazy foods that we have, the naan that we have.
Best in the world.
And we want to share our love with you, that we love you, no matter what religion, what race, what color, what tooth you have. As long as you're a human, we love you, and best of luck. Good job, Ash.
All right, well, as long as everybody, I don't know if Matt has anything he wants to end with or let anyone know out there, but if not, I can wrap us up.
Thank you. I'm honored. I wasn't sure how it would feel to open up about some of this because I honestly have been back in the US for a year and a half and have not talked about Iraq because I felt like I needed to let it sit. But I'm grateful. This was really good because I'm talking to people who get it. And that feels special. So I'm grateful to be able to talk to you guys. Thanks, Ash.
And that's very brave, Matt. Well done.
Well, I want to thank everybody out there for joining us today. Your presence, your energy has been felt and seen and appreciated. And this will continue to be on YouTube. So if you feel like sharing this, or if there's a piece of this discussion you want to go back to, and feel free to message me with questions or thoughts, you know, that is open to you. All of you who have been so supportive of this journey, I appreciate you very much. And so I'm going to leave it there and just express my gratitude and my gratitude to the entire panel here. And for all of you, may you live and move and have your being. Cheers.
Thank you.
I've ended the stream.